Okay, I think it is recording. Here we go. Okay. Hi, everyone, again, to a lot of you. And thanks for joining us from across the country and maybe around the world as well for Undamming the Klamath, Lessons for the Nation and the World. I'm Haley, and I work with Ríos to Rivers, and I'm one of the coordinators of the Rivers for Climate Coalition, which we're going to share about, and I'll be your facilitator. And we have one of our other coordinators, Chris, on the call as well. And this event, this webinar is part of a broader conversation about river restoration, Indigenous leadership, and climate justice, centered on the most significant dam removal in history, which is the undamming of the Klamath River in California and Oregon. So the Klamath River story is a testament to the power of persistence, intergenerational advocacy, and Indigenous sovereignty, and it holds important lessons for all of us about what it takes to restore a river, a people, and a future. I'm going to drop an announcement that this summer, some of our coalitions, organizations such as Ríos to Rivers, Water Climate Trust, and International Rivers are organizing an international in-person celebration of the Klamath Dam removal. And I'll put the link in just a little bit if you want to sign up to get more information about that. And so I'll drop that in just a bit. And then before we begin, I'd also like to take a moment to ground us in a sense of place and connection through a virtual land acknowledgement. As we gather in this virtual space, let us recognize that many of us are joining from lands that have been stewarded since time immemorial by Indigenous peoples. And we can honor the original caretakers of these lands and waters in the instance of the Klamath Basin, the Yurok Karuk, Hupa, and Klamath tribes, among others, who have fought for the health and freedom of the river and whose leadership has made this moment possible. We also acknowledge Indigenous nations from across the globe who continue to resist the exploitation of their forests, rivers, and homelands, and who remind us that the true climate solutions must be rooted in justice, reciprocity, and respect for Indigenous rights. And as we discuss dam removal, river healing, and a path forward, let's carry these truths with us and uplift the voices and visions of those who have always protected the waters. Now, before we dive in, let's just a quick housekeeping list. Please keep your microphones muted throughout the session. And if you forget, no worries. Our team may mute you to minimize background noise. After each speaker, we'll invite one or two clarifying questions, which you can type in the chat, and our coordinators will select those to ask live. And for all other questions, we're going to try to leave the majority of them for the end when we have a Q&A. And you can either drop them in the chat or raise your hand at the end if you have a question to ask. And also feel free to write in the chat right now where you're joining us from in the world. I'm going to admit someone else. Okay, so thank you again for being here and helping us create a respectful, engaging space. And with that, we can get started. I'm going to pass it off to Chris, who will give a short presentation about our coalition and the UnDam the UN campaign. And I'm going to share my screen so that he can tell us about that. Let's see. Okay, all you, Chris.
Great. Thanks, Haley. And it's a great pleasure to be here with Konrad, Ashia, Brook, and Haley. Great pleasure of working with them for the last few years with the Rivers for Climate Coalition. And the coalition, first and foremost, is about the members that make it strong. So we wanted to share a little bit about this coalition and how we work. So you can go to the next slide. Okay, so a little bit of background on this coalition. We're called Rivers for Climate. We came together in 2021 around a joint declaration that we filed at COP26 in Glasgow under the name of UnDam the UN. And we had actually, it was called the Rivers for Climate Declaration. That's right. And our UnDam the UN is our petition. And we filed that directly with the UN. It's searchable on the COP26 website, but it basically refers to the value of free-flowing rivers and the need to protect them and how dams are a false climate solution. Since then, the organizations have continued to coordinate. We've conducted side events at COP26, 27, 28, and we're now taking our collaboration to the next level by formalizing the coalition and just to strengthen our work going forward. You can take it to the next slide. So our mission statement really talks about our focus. We are a global alliance of organizations, and we are specifically working on international policies and financial mechanisms that are being used to proliferate hydropower dams around the world, and we are opposing those, and at the same time encouraging dam removal where that's possible. You can see us there marching. I believe that is at one of the COPs, and you can learn more about our work at undam.org. Next slide. So this is just a little bit about how we're organized, and we have two levels of membership in the coalition. The first are what we are consider our core members. These are the organizations that really participate on a biweekly basis. They have a vote in decision making for the coalition. They contribute expertise and time, and they really take on tasks to move the coalition's efforts forwards. And then we're also working on joint fundraising efforts where we can. And there's a small number of organizations that are participating at that level. We also, and individuals too, we do have individuals as core members as well. But we also have a broader Rivers for Climate Global Assembly that is open to anyone that is basically in support of the mission of the organization, and they will receive updates on campaign activities. They're invited to calls such as this one. They don't have a vote on the governance of the coalition, but there's ample opportunity to provide their views and to share their views to be taken into account during our decision making. And there's also opportunity to be listed on the website. And that's all I have, unless you have anything to add, Haley.
Nope, that was great. Thanks so much, Chris.
Yep.
Okay, so we are honored to be joined today by three incredible panelists whose work spans advocacy, science, and community action across watersheds and generations. We have Brook Tompson, Konrad Fisher, and Ashia Graywolf Wilson. And we're going to start today with Brook. And Brook is a Yurok and Karuk Native engineer, scientist, artist, author, and water rights activist. Her work blends Indigenous knowledge with Western science to restore rivers and protect tribal sovereignty. She's currently pursuing her Ph.D. at UC Santa Cruz, and I will let her take it from here. Welcome, Brook.
Thank you. So I'm going to share a bit about my experience on the Klamath River. And we'll start off with a little bit about my background. So I have a BS in civil engineering and with a minor in political science from Portland State University, an MS in civil engineering and environmental engineering with a focus on water resources and hydrology from Stanford. And now I am currently a third-year PhD student at UC Santa Cruz with a minor in coastal science and policy. And also an author. I recently just published a book this last month called I Love Salmon and Lamprey that is about the Klamath Dam removal in a way that's easy to explain for elementary school kids. And basically, if you want a summary of what I'm going to talk about in the next 15 minutes, it's all in this book if you forget. But yeah, I'm a researcher currently at UC Santa Cruz studying spring and fall salmon differences in the Klamath River. And I grew up at the mouth of the river. So I am where the star is that you can see in front of us, where the Klamath River meets the Pacific Ocean in the Yurok territory. I'm Yurok and Karuk, and I grew up right on the reservation where I got to spend most of my days salmon fishing with my family. And so basically, my entire childhood consisted of being on a metal drift boat and hanging out with my dad, my grandpa, my cousins, and my uncles, fishing daily, which was one of our main sources of food and income growing up. Like growing up on the Klamath River before when we had more salmon than we do now, I wouldn't have been able to afford school clothes growing up in such an economically deprived area if it wasn't for me selling fish and paying for my own school clothes and school supplies as a kid. But that is to say, my entire world revolved around the Klamath River and still does, but especially as a kid where I was on it every single day. And along with that, like I said, a lot of our food source came from salmon. So we eat salmon all year long, and just the fact that it's such a good source of vitamins, nutrients, and protein and healthy fats that we eat it throughout the summer and also smoke it and keep it throughout the winter. But one of the things that happened, and one of the reasons I went and got all these, fancy engineering degrees and am currently pursuing learning about salmon and advocacy around hydropower dam removal is in 2002, when I was 7 years old, I witnessed the 2002 fish kill firsthand. So I was 7 years old when this happened. I'm 29 now. And for me, the 2002 fish kill was not just about losing this food source, not just about losing this fun thing I do with my family, but it was losing this connection to my ancestors because since time immemorial, my family has been managing the salmon, and my ancestors have been managing these salmon's ancestors so that I could have a healthy amount to eat when I grew up. And that was all wiped around away when around 60,000 salmon died in September 2002. And also keeping in mind, you can see this photo of me, my dad, and the salmon in the center. These salmon that died this day were the size of my own body. And these are photos I took with my mom ourselves. And so you're literally seeing my viewpoint as the 7-year-old girl who not only sees these salmon as, our economic well-being, our food, and my connection to my family, but then also like my relatives, they're part of my family, they're part of my culture. And seeing all these bodies my own size that I were alive the night before that I care about deeply rotting has been really traumatizing to me and for many other tribal members. And I have since then tried to do everything I can with my path being through education and protesting and advocacy to make sure this never happens again, not only to my river, but for anyone's river. And one of the large reasons this fish kill happened was because of the hydropower dams, or just the dams in general in the Klamath River. And that led me to a life of activism, which is where I really was able, felt like I could have any impact as someone who was not yet an adult. And I went to many protests and rallies, whether that be in Sacramento at the federal building for the state, or at the state building, or in Portland, Oregon at the Pacific Corps headquarters. So I have traveled very far and wide throughout California and Oregon, and basically just trying to add one more voice to and one more body to the fight for dam removal, recognizing that so many people worked so hard to organize this, and I was a kid when all this was going on. So my part was very small, but a shout out to, everyone who put in all that time and effort and created all these communities to work together in order to make all this a reality. And also keeping in mind, you'll see Konrad with a timeline in a little bit here, but I like to just keep the broader picture of like an indigenous mindset. And we really focus usually only on like the very recent times, whether that be like election cycles, like even the last like 4 to 6 years, 2 to 4 6 years, which is usually how I see policy considered, or considering even like our and our grandparents' lifetimes. But for me, I'm considering the entire time, which for California natives is approximated to be around 15,000 years, that we've been here. And if you see the slide, all this blue is the time California natives have been in California. And the little yellow thing on the right-hand side is the amount of time Westerners have been here or had contact with my tribe. So around the 1850s, around the time of the gold rush. And we have never had any type of travesty that compares to the fish kill in our entire history here and through our oral history than what happened in 2002. And just some pictures that illustrate what the dams did to the river. This is a picture of where the Trinity River meets, which is the largest tributary to the Klamath meets. And this looks like healthy water to me. But then behind the dams, you had this bright, toxic green algae that not only looked scary, I wouldn't want to swim in that, but also smelled horrible too. It's a smell similar to if you have a compost bin in your house and you go on vacation, you forget to take it out and you come back and it just reeks of rotting vegetation. And so these are some photos I saw when doing revegetation and work in preparation for the dam removal and grubbing of invasive species. But this blue-green algae was also super detrimental to my tribal members. Like I used to swim in the river growing up, and then all of a sudden there's all these signs in the summer saying the blue-green algae that was exacerbated by the dams made it so that it was toxic to touch the water and that kids and animals could potentially get very sick and die from it. And my family members went to the hospitals multiple times because of contact with this blue-green algae that was suddenly super present in the water. And that was hard for me too, because I know kids nowadays did not get to grow up playing in the water like I had the privilege to growing up. And just some of the impacts of the Klamath River dams, without getting too much into it, is increases in water temperature, increases in disease and parasite rates, cutting off all that natural spawning habitat, these increases of toxic blue-green algae blooms and disruption of natural flows of the water, but also the sediment cycles, because sediment can't get behind the dam. So all these soils and nutrients that are supposed to be going throughout the system are all of a sudden stuck. And that all leads to decrease in salmon populations, which leads to health impacts and cultural impacts in my tribe that has directly related to death for tribal members, whether that be through cardiovascular disease and that risk increasing or diabetes, or even the suicide rates in my tribe. Because for me, there's no way that the loss of salmon and thus the loss of culture and this time with family has not decreased our mental health in my area. So much so that there has been times in the tribe where we've had to declare a state of emergency for amount of suicides. And on a brighter note, I have had the privilege to see the dam removal this last year firsthand, where this was the bottom of Iron Gate about 4 years ago. And this is the same area just this last summer. And so you can see in this photo how much brighter I'm smiling and just how brilliant and how impactful this dam removal has been on my, like talking about mental health, on my mental health. It really feels like the weight of these dams have been on my shoulders, have finally been lifted off, and I can take a deep breath for once in my life. And this is Iron Gate from above. And one of the cool things about the dam removal is, it seems like this huge immovable object that is like, how do we even get rid of something that's that big? And then when they started taking it down, it's right, it ends up just being a bunch of smaller piles of rocks at the end of the day. And just to see where I'm at, I'm on the first scoop taken from Iron Gate Dam. And this is the coolest pile of dirt and rocks in the world to me. I actually keep a few in my office from this pile. And just knowing that, despite the adults at the time and all these people organizing who were told that this was an impossible task, that we could ask for one, but four was out of the question, or that we would never be able to make agreements with these different groups and, these people benefiting off the dams, just hoping we would fight each other forever. If we're able to come together and share similar values and understand like each other's needs, where we still have disagreements, but understanding that at the end of the day, our values around wanting to pass on traditions, wanting to have our families live in this area that we have been on for generations and be able to make an income and a sustainable living are very similar. And being able to build these groups that we thought maybe we were initially opposed to one another, but at least on some points we could agree and work together. And this is Iron Gate from that same location, post dam removal. So this is also Copco and one of the Copcos, and this is the same location post dam removal. And not only has the dam removal honestly gone better than expected, this being the largest dam removal in US history and maybe world history, this there was so many things that could have gone wrong, but there was so much diligent work and also like plan Bs if things did go wrong. But yet, like, this was such a successful project that it's been really inspiring to, I think, a lot of other groups as well. And so many lessons learned when it comes to like the engineering and also when it comes to, right, not only the science side, but the people side and also the communication to the public piece. But then, in addition to that, the restoration has gone better than expected. This is a photo of me doing some grubbing, taking out invasive species a few years before dam removal and then replanting seeds that were initially gathered by hiring contract through the Yurok tribe of indigenous workers to collect these seeds and have that chance to reconnect with the environment and native plants, and then also feeling like they can contribute because they are to the future of the health of the river, and then being able to replant them, and even the revegetation has gone better than expected, in my understanding. With the dam removal, also salmon coming back where we didn't know how long it was going to take for them to go above the dam location. We're like, oh, it might take a few years. But no, immediately, about a month after the dam was taken down, salmon returned beyond the dam site, even though they usually go back to where they spawned. So that has been outstanding as well. And over 6,000 salmon actually returned above the dam site this last year, which is so exciting to hear that, we thought it might take a few years to see results, and yet we're seeing results much sooner than anticipated. Keeping that in mind, I just also want to say that when it comes to like doing this research on the dam, as a restoration engineer for the Yurok tribe, we have partnered with Oregon State University and the Sea Grant Oregon to do studies on water quality and how it impacts the health of the food web in the area, and also how different groups see decisions influencing the river health and how those intersect or differ across, like, say, agriculture farmer groups, Yurok tribal members, ocean fishermen, and conservation organizations in order to try to create a better map of how we can maybe come together or misunderstandings we have to make these contributions and communities stronger together and more informed. And also in addition to looking at algae, sediment, and all these natural science approaches to the dam and combining that social science and natural science processes. But this funding that I've been working on with this project for the last 3 years was cut just a week ago. So it was funded by the NOAA Sea Grant, and I found out a week ago that we're no longer allowed to make any more expenditures on the Klamath River work going forward. That's really devastating because we only have this one chance to study the river conditions right before and right after dam removal. And yet now we have no funding to do so in the name of quote unquote right government efficiency with this administration. Every contract with NOAA has to be reviewed now by the secretary. And it's such a long list, and we were told by the director of the Sea Grant that it's not clear if the funding is ever going to come. So it has been frustrating to try to figure out this combination of how we can continue to do this work so we can inform future dam removals, and also, the pros and cons, or just let like figuring out more of these lessons learned that we're here to talk about today. And right now I'm just trying to figure out how to keep this work going so this results can be used to influence future dam removals. But that is my presentation, and I will pass it back to you. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Brooke. I love the timeline you included to remind us like how long your peoples have been here and also how quickly we've managed to decimate those fish populations, but also how encouraging and incredible that after 100 years of not being able to go up that river, that fish remember that that's where they belong and are able to and are returning to that place. And also, I know that funding has also been taken away from other restoration efforts on the Klamath. So, a big reminder that there's a lot more work to do and that fight still continues. Okay, next we're going to welcome Konrad. And Konrad is the founder and director of Water Climate Trust, a nonprofit working to restore rivers and protect communities from false climate solutions. Konrad is an expert on water allocation and climate mitigation policy with deep roots in the Klamath River activism and water justice. He's supported advocacy and litigation to undam the Klamath River and is currently focused on keeping enough water in the river for fish and river-dependent communities. So I'll pass it off to Konrad, and I'm also going to share my screen again for your presentation.
Thanks, Haley, and thanks everyone for coming tonight. Again, my name is Konrad. My family moved to the Klamath Basin just 4 generations ago. My grandparents moved to the upper Klamath Basin in Klamath tribe territory during the Great Depression. My home is in the lower Klamath Basin in Karuk territory, and I've been lucky enough to have my job involve trying to get the dams out and trying to keep enough water in rivers. So I just want to kind of present what I consider uh, the different episodes of how this effort started. So the first episode I consider from 2002 fish kill until 2010 when there was an agreement signed. So this part of the history is often lost, but why did the fish die? They died in large part because of this guy who was George Bush's boss. He was actually the vice president, but he often had more power. So because of a disease that was occurring in the Klamath, the short name is ICH, the scientists for the federal government said, if you don't release more water this year, a lot of salmon will die. And this guy, Dick Cheney, called the scientists, the federal scientists, and said, throw your science out and keep the water in Oregon and give it to the farmers in Oregon. Next slide. So that was essentially what caused the fish kill we've heard so much about. So there's a disease. When the water levels are low, the fish congregate in smaller areas. Also, because of the dams, toxic algae grows more behind the dams and fills the river, and then the toxic algae actually takes oxygen out of the water. So low flows were making the fish congregate more, and low oxygen was making them weak and susceptible to spreading the disease and dying. And this is what happened. So next slide. This just kind of shows what's coming out of the dams. And this was one of the biggest problems. This toxic algae, as Brooke said, smells awful. It also takes the air out of the water. Next slide. So the trauma from the fish kill was horrible. I lived in Karuk territory at the time. It's still my home, but that's where I was. And people were literally showing up at my door whom I had never met, saying, let's sign a petition, let's figure out what to do about this. And I see that as a moment when entities that were kind of focused on their own cause and tribes that were focused on getting what piece of the fish pie might be, theirs versus others, everyone then focused together on getting the dams out. So thanks to Dick Cheney and the horrible, traumatizing fish kill, this movement was born. And in this era, from the fish kill until 2010, the main targets in campaign speak were the owners of the dams, the regulatory agencies trying to get them to enforce the law, and then electricity ratepayers, because part of the issue was we had to show that if you comply with existing laws, it will be more expensive to keep the dams than it would be to remove them. So therefore, because dams and electricity are a regulated monopoly, whatever the company chose to do, the owner chose to do, the cost would be passed on to electricity ratepayers. So it took a lot of effort saying, yes, dam removal is going to show up on your electric bill, and I have one of mine where it shows up, but that number would be much bigger if it was dam retrofitting. Next slide. So this is a demonstration of, this is one of many demonstrations in Portland, bringing the toxic algae to Pacificor, which was the company that owned the dams. Next slide. Pacificor in this era from 2002 to 2010 changed ownership. So Pacificor initially, when we first started this campaign, was owned by Scottish Power. So the representatives from tribes throughout the Klamath Basin flew to Scotland. And at the time, the people in Scotland were saying, oh, we want to be allies of the Native Americans. And Scottish Power board of directors didn't like the fact that they were owned dams that were harming tribes in the US. So rather than fix the problem, they sold the dams to Warren Buffett, to the company he controls, which is Berkshire Hathaway. So that's the company that owned the dams in the end. So pictured on the right here is a tribal member speaking to the entire gathering, the annual gathering of Warren Buffett and the shareholders of Berkshire Hathaway. So you wait in line long enough and you get to speak. Next slide. So this in 2010 was the culmination of all of the effort and lawsuits, protests, and then the ratepayer campaign. Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was the governor of California, actually did say this. He said, it's time to say hasta la vista to the Klamath dams. So next slide, please. This is a very short snippet of kind of the two eras of dam removal. So 2010 to 16, the signing of the first KHSA, which is Klamath Hydroelectric Settlement Agreement, with the KBRA, which was a water, I call it a water and money agreement, Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement. Those two were a package, and those two agreements basically hitched dam removal to the KBRA, which required an act of Congress, and it included what, in the words of Obama's point person, quote, waiver of claim to tribal water rights, which basically meant for a certain amount of water and a certain amount of money, there will be no claims in excess of that certain amount of money and certain amount of water. So that's the agreement that was pushed for from 2010 until 2016, well, until December of 2015. And I'm skipping some slides, but I'm happy to share there are some line items, but I'm happy to share this later. But in December of 2015, Congress let the clock run out on passing a bill that would have allowed the KBRA to go through. Immediately after that happened, I called the point person for Pacificor, the owner of the dams, and said, can't we get the dams out without a money water slash deal that requires an act of Congress? He said, of course, as long as we have the same assurances. We're not interested in that. We're already agreed we want the dams out. We just need to protect our ratepayers. So within a few months, there was what I call the Dam Removal Agreement 2.0 that was signed in April 2016. So that included most of the same dam removal agreement, but without the need for an act of Congress to achieve the two things, money and a waiver of claim to tribal water rights. So to me, that is as big of a victory in any of this, that we got the dams out without a water deal that, given climate change, would have been bad and would have prevented the Klamath tribes from exercising their rights in ways they have since that time. Next slide. So this is the signing ceremony of 2016. That was an amazing day hosted by the Yurok tribe. And that's the agreement that ultimately got the dams out to this day. So next slide. So this is kind of the implementation schedule of the amended KHSA. I guess one of the big takeaways is that that deal involved the creation of a separate entity, the Klamath River Renewal Corporation, to take ownership of the dams and go through the process of removing them. So this served a few purposes. It helped Pacificor limit / cap their liability, because it was going to be a different entity taking control while the dams were removed. But it required a lot of different processes, including Clean Water Act certifications from California and Oregon, approval from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They'd never really done this before, the US entity that controls energy production. But ultimately, all the approvals were achieved. The initial target was to have the dams out by 2020, but we saw them removed in over the last year and a half. So, next slide. So these are the 4 dams that were removed. There are a few more in the Upper Klamath Basin, but these are the 4 that were removed: Copco 1, Copco 2, Iron Gate, and then of those 4, J.C. Boyle is one that is in Oregon. Next slide. This is a very exciting photo of crews drilling a hole at the base of the dam. So they basically would drill, I don't know, 85% of the way, walk some dynamite in there so that later they could blow the last little plug and then have free-flowing water underneath the dam. But before the plugs were blown, they lowered the reservoirs as much as possible so it wasn't a torrent of water coming down. Next slide. This one was dismantled with machines as opposed to blowing a plug with a hole in the bottom with dynamite. Next slide. And this is one that I got to witness. This is J.C. Boyle Dam in Oregon. So this is the day the dynamite blew the plug on this dam. They couldn't lower it any more than that. That little teeny plume of smoke in the distance was the dynamite. And then next slide, about 4 hours later, it started to look like a river. None of us knew how fast it would happen, but that was just 4 hours later. And then the next slide is the following morning. It looks even more like a mucky reservoir. So this is a place any of you can go to from Klamath Falls, Oregon. I would encourage you to go look at it. It's looking in a lot better shape now than it does in this photo. Next slide. So the result from the perspective of a fish was, for 100 years, the red area was the end of the road for them. That's as far as they could go. They didn't make it from California into Oregon for 100 years as they had through history. Next slide. And this shows hopefully the new range. This map was made by Federal Bureau of Reclamation, and that line in the middle is the California-Oregon border. So I'll stop there and pass it back to Haley, but if you have questions at the end, we're all here for that. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Konrad. It's amazing to see such a huge, complex, convoluted, and tumultuous process be consolidated in such a nice, concise timeline. So thank you for doing that. Up next, we have Ashia Wilson, who's Klamath-Modoc, so upper basin tribes, and she's going to share with us a bit about her experience as well. Off to you, Ashia.
Thank you for that introduction, Haley, and I will screen share now. Can you guys see that okay? Present it. Okay. Thank you for that intro. My name is Ashia Wilson. I live in Fort Klamath, Oregon. It's at the top of the Klamath Basin. I'm an enrolled member in the Klamath tribes. I'm Klamath and Modoc, and I just like to include a few photos of myself and my family. And so in these photos here, I have a son, Kanoa, and he's in the left side photos, and my niece. And then on the right side at the bottom, there's a photo of me and a few of my brothers and my
Ashia,
dad.
I'm gonna interrupt you because we don't see it's not in present mode quite yet.
Okay, let's see.
You don't see the bottom right photo.
I'm viewing mine in present mode. Let's see. Sorry, I think I have this issue.
You might if you're just sharing the screen, you might not have shared the presenter screen because it opens up as a new tab. So you might want to reshare your screen and share your entire window.
Did that work or no?
That works.
Better. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, okay. Thank you guys for stopping me because yeah, I could just see the full presentation. Yeah, these are some family photos. At the top right side, I like to include this photo. At the top right of that photo is my 3 times great grandma, Nancy Phillips, and then her children and grandchildren, and my grandpa's on that right side canoe. And so I just like to include these photos to kind of show that even though the Klamath Lake has been cut off from the river and stagnant, and a lot of our tributaries have been depleted, and some are now non-navigable. Our people have always been canoe people. We've always been water people, and it's something that um, a lot of our families have lost with the last 100 years of dams and colonial impacts. These are photos, more photos. I just like to share photos of my cute son. And so on the left side, that's him eating huckleberries last summer. And then on the right side, that's me, my niece, my son, and one of our paddling students up on the Deschutes River. Um, I just like to share the photos of Kano because he's so cute, but then also to just kind of explain like our connection to place, our connection to water, and connection to family is a super big thing in my family and in my life. And so these photos right here are of me when I was a little kid up in Portland at the Pacific Corp protests. My mom has always been super involved in tribal politics, and so she's been sure to bring her kids along to everything that she does. And so I'm fortunate now that I get to include my son in the same things and not as much protest, but just enjoying our lands and our waterways. I know that Brooke and Konrad gave really good information in setting the timeline and scene for the dam removal with the Klamath, so I won't speak too much about this, but I just have these maps in here to give people an idea of the Klamath Basin. On the left side, you see the whole basin. On the right side, you can see in that red line, that's the ceded lands of the Klamath-Modoc people. And then in the black line is the original reservation agreement that we had negotiated with the US government. And what we ended up getting was just like a small box right here. And so we ceded over 23 million acres of land in the signing of our treaty of 1864. Another point I like to just share with you guys is, as Conrad shared, it's been 100 years since salmon were able to access this section of the river. And so that means for the past 109, 10 years, Klamath-Modoc people have lost that connection and relationship to salmon. We used to have that as one of our main foods, but we haven't had that for over a century. And so I think just understanding the difference between the upper basin and the lower basin tribes and just the realities that we've been forced to live due to these colonial impacts is super important. And so since 1916, with the construction beginning on these dams, we haven't had a flowing river. We have lost that connection. And since 1871, one of our main tributaries, the Wood River right here, has been manipulated. So since 1871, we've had water diversion. So for over 150 years, Klamath-Modoc people have had to deal with the environmental and cultural implications caused by manipulating our waterways. Along the lines of that, on the left side of this photo, you see some of the cleanest, purest, most beautiful water that exists, not just in the Upper Klamath Basin or in the basin, but globally. And so we have a lot of visitors that come to see this spring because it's beautiful, it's drinkable water, and there's a species called mare's eggs that exist in this spring, and they only exist in two places in the whole world. And so here and then in some crazy spring rainforest places in Japan, and it's a little living black pebble, it looks like when you look in our spring, and they can only exist in super clean and pure water. And so you can see the whole beds of our spring here that are covered in mare's eggs. And the further you go down our river, just like one or two little bends after the spring, those mare's eggs disappear, and the ag runoff from farming just right at the spring below it just heavily impacts the water. And so even though this water is still drinkable today, 18 miles down, it turns into what you see on the right side of this photo. And so the upper Klamath Lake during summer months with the toxic algae blooms that Brick was talking about, they pollute our water so bad that our fish end up suffocating in the water in the summer times. And so we'll have, I think since 2017, we've had just mass fish kills every so often where our fishery staff in the area have to go out by boat and just pick up dead fish. And so it's really alarming to see the difference in water quality in such a short amount of time in river miles in the upper basin. I like to share a little bit about our WOCUS and our trauma and COP2 as well. I know that salmon is one of our keystone species in the basin, but these other first foods are super significant to Klamath-Modoc people and have sustained us since time immemorial on our lands. And so at that top left photo, that's our WOCUS. And on the right side, you could see all the lily pads. And so the WOCUS pods are just the pods that are there before they bloom into a yellow flower. And so before it blooms, we go and we collect them, we dry them out, we take the seeds out, and we make mush or flour out of the seeds. And I've grown up collecting WOCUS my whole life. My father made me and my brothers get WOCUS and learn how to harvest it and process that. And it tastes awful, I'll be honest. But our old people, when they are about to pass, there's been two of our elders that we were close with where this is a food that most families I didn't know haven't continued to gather and to process for a long time. And so when these family members were passing, they reached out to my family and asked if we had any mush that they could eat before they had passed on. And so just to have that taste one last time, it was super significant for our elders. And same goes for our trauma and cop too. My auntie was almost in her 90s when my son was born, and our little fishies have been on the ESA since the 1980s. And my auntie asked, can you please go get me a sucker to eat before I die? And so that's what my family did, even though it's been illegal for us to consume them since the 80s. That was her dying wish, was just to taste that fish one last time. And so I just wanted to paint that picture because even though we've lost salmon for a century, we haven't been able to eat our trauma or crop two since the 80s. And now, within my lifetime, we're also losing locust. And so I'm in my early 20s, and I thought that that was like a given. I understand the fishing and hunting is something that is super depleted and impacted with our ag production and our forestry management, but I thought at least I had locust that I could share with my son. And so when my son was about to turn 2, I took him out with my father to this marsh that you see at the top right side with this elk. And it was completely dry. And so my son got to walk on a dry bed and play with the dead locust pods that didn't even get as big as you see in this left side. And it was just really eye-opening for me to see that the other year and understand that we're still losing so much. We've already lost over around 90% of our wetlands and our marshes that had locusts. And so losing 90% of this food source has been a big hit on Klamath-Modoc people. A little bit about our Chwam and Koptu. They're an endemic fish species in the upper Klamath Lake systems. So they exist nowhere else in the world but in our lakes. And in the early 1900s, our settlers that came into the upper Klamath Basin were canning Chwam and Koptu and selling them in their stores. By the 1960s, they were doing heavy snag fisheries and just mass killing Chwam and Koptu, leaving them on our banks for dead. They wouldn't eat them. They would just kill them and leave them for dead, just piles and piles of them as a statement towards their tribal members in the upper basin with the water wars against our ag community. And then by 1971, California law recognized these species as threatened, and by 1988, they were listed on the ESA. And we have not had successful recruitment, so they haven't been able to live until adulthood, have babies, and watch those babies grow up since the early 1990s. And so our oldest Chwam should be about 34 or 35 years old, and our oldest Koptu should be about 57 or 58 years old. And so these fish are pushing 60 years of age and still trying to hold on. And in 2016, USGS published a report, and I'm pretty sure it was based on 2001 to 2015. And the numbers that we saw in that report showed a 60% decline in Chwam population. And there's spring spawners and river spawners. There was about 100,000 river spawners in 2015 and about 8,000 spring spawners. Right now, currently, we have a little less than 5,000 combined that are left in the wild. And then in 2015, we had about, I believe it was almost 20,000 Koptu that were left in 2015. And we have about 2,000 Koptu left in the wild now. And so they faced around a 78% decline by 2015. And our fisheries crew tried to be hopeful. We were really hopeful, but the reality is that we're on the brink of extinction for these fish. And so we've lost salmon, we've lost a lot of our elk and our deer, we're losing our wilgus, and our chwam are on the way out. And that's just a really unfortunate reality that we have to face. And I know that we are standing in celebration for our dam removal and the return of our salmon and the successes of our lower tribes, but I just like to share this information in hopes that we can have others stand in solidarity with us, with our fight for our Chwam and our Koptu. I forgot to mention that last photo on the bottom left is from the early 1900s, and that's just some of our Chwam and Koptu, and so it's been a main food source and very tasty fish. These photos I just threw in here to kind of give you guys an idea about our ag and our water diversions. And so although it's not just hydroelectricity or the Link River Dam or the Keno Dam, but a big issue that we face in the Klamath Basin is water diversions to ag. And so the bottom left photo, this is what my son had to walk on to get her wilkus the other year. This is all we have left is if we have any water, it's a small little creek. But when we went that last summer, it was completely dry. The top left photo is what I was talking about with our fish kills in the summertime, where our fisheries crew just have to go pick up our dead fishies. And so this is a common look during the really bad toxic algae blooms. And then that right side photo is the first water diversion on the southern end of the Upper Klamath Lake. And so when you stand at the Link River Dam, you can look over and see this diversion, this A canal. And I think it's just important for us to understand when talking about the Klamath that not only do we have to fight to get water in the Klamath River, but there's over 200,000 acre-feet of water that are being diverted from the Wood, Sprague, and Williamson rivers that are the main tributaries to the Upper Klamath Lake. And it's unregulated water diversions that come out and feed farms. But then at this diversion facility at Canal A, we have like 240,000 acre-feet of water that are diverted from the lake before it can hit the river to go downriver to support our lower tribes and our salmon relatives. And so it's just a really difficult conversation in reality and political arena to talk about water, especially in the Upper Klamath Basin, because of all the tribes in the conversation, the ag, and the different departments of our government. And my side note is we're fighting over this water, but it's, as you see, it's very green, it's very toxic, and it's full of neurotoxins. And so we're fighting for a little bit left for our fish to not suffocate. And the farmers are fighting to feed their cows and their potatoes that end up on our plates. And so all around, it's kind of a big concern environmentally and health-wise. I know that was a lot of sad information. And so I threw these photos in here to just go back to that hopeful and celebratory story of the Klamath. And so middle picture is the section that is under the J.C. Boyle area on the Klamath. This is the J.C. Boyle Dam right here on the right side. And that's my niece with the sledgehammer and her paddling on one of the tributaries to the Upper Klamath Lake on that left side. And so I'm gonna hop back a few before I'm done talking. She's paddling on this Sprague River right here, and this is the original spawning grounds of the salmon that are from the Klamath Basin. And so just to think that they're making it up to about this area right here now, and they need to be able to make it up here. And so we still got some work to do. And I think beyond that, I'll just leave with the note that although we had the lower four dams removed, we still have the Link River and the Keno dams that remain closest to us on our waters. And so I know there's conversations about the Keno Dam being removed, but beyond that, we don't only need fish passage for our salmon relatives, but there is no passage for our chwam, our cockatoo, our lamprey, and our eels in the upper basin to go through the Link River Dam. And so that is a big concern and something that needs to be addressed soon. And that's all I have to share with you guys.
Thanks so much, Ashia. I'm also going to put a plug about that photo, that last photo, and with your niece, Ashia's niece, and a larger group of Native youth are going to make the first descent of the undammed, or of the Klamath in its undammed form this July, which is really exciting, which is going to culminate in that river celebration that I mentioned before. But yeah, Asia, it's so impactful to hear about the deep value of those endemic species to your family ancestrally and also to that whole ecosystem in the region. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm curious about whether there's hope for the Chwam and Cockatoo. If as people are either putting questions in the chat or raising their hand on Zoom, we can want to open up the Q&A. And I see Halsey was the first question. How was the electric supply replacement handled? Was this a significant issue or was it more of an issue of water rights for agriculture? Halsey, feel free to jump in if you want to expand on that or direct it at a certain panelist.
Well, I'll tell you the reason I ask that is that just in the last couple weeks, I was contacted by a young woman from the northern part of Maine who was recently hired as a fisheries biologist by the Holton Band of Maliseet Indians who span northern Maine into New Brunswick, Canada. And she was hired to help them to try to restore the salmon run on the major river that runs between the two countries up there, and which is being frustrated by a major dam in New Brunswick, Canada, which is there because it provides 660 megawatts of electricity, which is about, almost a quarter of the electricity to the people in New Brunswick. And just in talking with her initially, I said, you were hired as a biologist, but your job as a community organizer, I mean, she's really got to work on, kind of replicating what you're talking about here. And the major issue there is going to be, how do you get that electricity replaced? Because the issue is not so much water for agriculture, it's water for, it's hydropower. That's why I bring it up.
I can speak to that, but Ashia, Brooke, you want to go? Or whatever you want. So the Klamath dams didn't produce that much power. It was enough for about 70,000 homes, about 170,000 megawatts. In the time we've been talking about taking them out, more than that much amount of power has been put online by things that are arguably more eco-groovy, like solar. So it's kind of a drop in the bucket. And I say, unless there's a grid that's kind of closed, I think of electricity more like rice on the global market. Just because you take 20 acres out of production in California doesn't mean you necessarily have to produce 20 more acres somewhere else. It's kind of fluid. It can go all the way from the Columbia River in Portland to Los Angeles. So it's doesn't have to be replaced, but it was, and it wasn't enough to be significant. And just some other questions. The Klamath dams aren't critical to this water supply issue. Like they're not part of the water infrastructure to deliver water to ag, and that's not why they were built. That's part of the reason it was politically viable to take them out. And that's also the reason the biggest issue remaining is dealing with unjust water allocation, extreme waste, and the fact that more water is going for cow food and potatoes than traditional food sources for the tribes.
Would you reiterate the question one more time? I want to make sure I understood it, or if there's anything that wasn't answered in it.
The question was about whether or not replacing the electricity that was created by the dams was a significant issue in wanting to keep the dams, and in taking down the dams, how that electric supply, if it was a significant issue, was replaced.
Oh yeah. Much like Conrad said, all that plus it was only about 2% of the energy source for Pacific Power in that area. So because right, we've been doing the SAM removal conversation for over 24 years now. As Asia and I were kids at the Portland building to now we're adults, to the fact that they've had all this time to figure out other energy sources to replace it. So they have replaced those energy sources that were being lost from the dams by several times over through other renewable power sources, such as wind and solar. And so there was actually no impact, negatively, from removing the dams and that hydropower from the system. In addition to that, as dam infrastructure and hydropower ages, with some of these dams reaching close to 100, they become less efficient over time because dams operate from a drop in height. And as that sediment piles up, you have less and less water capacity that's held behind there. And it's actually one of the reasons that the what's that dam? Not the Hoover Dam, but the dam on the Colorado River, gosh, this is gonna kill me. Glen Canyon Dam. It's one of the reasons the Glen Canyon Dam is being considered to be removed in the future, because in the next few years, that dam will not create any hydropower whatsoever because of all the sediment buildup behind it and its aging infrastructure. So long story short, it was not a significant loss to get rid of that dam electricity wise, and they've replaced it several fold.
Yeah, and then just to add on there, the Link River Dam and the Keno Dam do not currently produce any electricity at all. So the two remaining dams have no energy production. And then I know that the Brick and Connor just reiterated that, but I'm pretty sure, if my understanding is correct, Warren Buffett, the previous owner of the Klamath dams, was into this deal because it wasn't worth his money to relicense and update the infrastructure to keep his dams operating. So the only reason they finally said yes and acted on this dam removal was it wasn't worth their money anymore. So yeah.
I think that actually transitions into Becky's question about is there any opportunity to remove other dams and those dams in the Upper Klamath?
Aisha, you touched on that earlier today. You want to say what you said before?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we all touched on it, but Brooke shared that the BOR is in conversation about the removal of the Keno Dam potentially in the next few years, hopefully. There hasn't really been much communication about the Link River Dam that's gone out, but once the BOR has the time to do the appropriate studies, they say, and analysis on the two remaining dams, then they'll make more public statements about it. So yeah, hopefully that Keno one that's supposed to regulate the river flow can come out here soon, but the Link River Dam might be a bit more difficult. When they built the Link River Dam and the Keno Dam, it was the perfect spot to put these dams because of the natural basalt reefs that regulated the water and the flows of our rivers. And so what they did was they blew those natural basalt reefs up and built a huge dam on top of them. And so if they remove these dams, I think if I understand correctly, it would just be a little different in comparison to the lower dam removals because of taking that natural element out of our water regulation. And so I know that Brooke and Conrad could speak more about that too, though.
Yeah, so what I've been told is the Bureau of Reclamation is currently, like Aisha said, doing feasibility studies on fish passage through the Keno, and right, their decision might be like, oh, fish passage might be something that's doable and relatively inexpensive and successful compared to, say, taking the dam out and like looking at the costs and benefits between those two. And so I'm expecting they'll have a better idea. Well, we'll see because everything's a little bit in chaos federally. But well, well, I was hoping they would make it maybe a decision this next year. But we'll see how that goes. I think that's one of the things worth expressing concern about to the BOR. And with that, kind of like was said with the Link River, that's much more difficult because that regulates flows and has irrigation holds that are much more difficult to replace. But regardless, there should be fish passage in all these remaining dams, whether or not they're removed fully or not.
They
Awesome.
covered it well enough. I don't need to say anything.
Great. Clifford, I thought I saw your hand up. If you want to speak, you're welcome to.
It was just a question about the location in New Brunswick compared to the location in, I guess, where you are, Oregon. Is that the state that you guys are in?
Oregon
Is
and
it
California.
Oregon, okay, or California. Temperature-wise, in both of those regions are not similar. What I guess the point I'm getting at is that maybe people up in New Brunswick aren't dealing with the extreme extent of poisoning of the water as you guys are out there, because their temperatures are cooler. But that still, and that was just a question I had. There's any? I know that waters warm up when they're dammed. There's no question about that. And I know that dams hold back all the sediment and the nutrient. but the temperatures that we're experiencing in New Brunswick compared to in California or Oregon are considerably warmer. And maybe that's speeding up that poison, that anaerobic condition, and the newer toxins, the
The
heating of that region. But
toxic algae, uh, toxic algae is worse in the summer. It's worse when it's warm. But the toxic algae was one of many reasons to take the Klamath dams out. So just fixing the toxic algae doesn't allow salmon to swim into Oregon also. Like there's
no,
fish passage, all kinds of other reasons that would
yeah,
apply to places.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, I was just kind of curious about the temperature difference, how fast the toxic algae would build in one area compared to the other.
So what's happening with these dams is that what happened with the dams, we've seen like there has been a huge reduction in the toxic blue-green algae since they've been removed almost immediately. So I'm hoping that's not an issue going forward. But what was happening too, it's not just air temperature. Air temperature is one thing, but the fact that water retains heat to a certain amount. So you have to think if you have like free flowing river, that ends up being a lot cooler than if you have like basically what's a pot, as in like the reservoir sitting in the sun. And so if it's hotter up in that like deserty region and it heats up all that water, when it gets released, that water doesn't automatically cool right away as the air temperature gets cooler in these different regions. That warm water still goes down. And actually, just me being at the mouth of the Klamath River, like right hundreds of miles downstream, we've seen the difference in like mine and my family's lifetime, where usually the water would be around like 50-ish degrees Fahrenheit, or at least cooler than the air temperature. And it's pretty cool down here most of the time. But in recent years, it's the water's been way warmer than the air temperature has been. And actually, like you'll see the river steaming because the water is so much warmer than the air temperature, and it feels like bath water more so than it does like a cool, healthy river that can store dissolved oxygen. And so, despite the weather being different and the air temperature being different, that doesn't necessarily change the water temperature right away. And that has to do with how much the water stores heat and how fast the water is getting from the upper Klamath to the mouth.
One other thing I wanted to mention, that it seems like the planet has natural immune systems like humans. And I'm wondering if, increased algae or increased phytoplankton or what they call sargassum along the continental shelf is a response that the climate is having to imbalances that are caused by humans. That's all I have to say.
I would just say I don't know as much about the ocean health and the science behind that because the ocean is so complex. I took an ocean engineering class once, and even just understanding how waves works. I have two Stanford engineering degrees, and that was too confusing for me. And or I have a Stanford engineering degree, but then it's so that when I get to ocean stuff, because the ocean's so vast and there's so many things interacting with it, long story short, I don't have a good answer for that. I also see Katie has a question in the chat about the water too with the temperature. So I want to say that like you mentioned that low water. So the question was along with runoff too in the Eel River watershed, the toxic algae is from low water, warmer temperatures and runoff from fertilizer from cannabis farms are too common in the hills. Is this part of the problem in the Klamath watershed algae growth? And just to say that, right, the less water you have to also increases the ability for it to warm as well. So, right, that's playing into it. And also the algae likes nutrients, so like phosphorus and nitrogen. And so anywhere it can get that from, regardless if that's from like, different types of fertilizer or these additives to soil that get run off and put into the river, anytime you have more of those nutrients, it's going to cause increased algae growth. I don't know if Ashia or Konrad, you want to add to that?
I mean, I think Brooke, you definitely covered the science. In the Upper Klamath Basin in Oregon, like where Ashia lives, the cowboys are wasting insane amounts of water, flood irrigating, in part because they're under this illusion that if they don't use their full water right, which is often more than the cows in the field actually want, that they'll lose their water right. In reality, the law says the state could cut off their water right or reduce their size of their water right, but they never do. So that myth is causing people to flood irrigate their fields, cows standing in 10 inches of water, washing the cow shit in the lake, in the upper Klamath Lake and then in the river. So if we could just deal with wasteful water use and this water allocation issue, we would solve two problems, the big part of the pollution problem and the water quantity and stream flow problem.
Aisha, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that Brooke and Conrad summed it up pretty well. And the Wood River. So the Wood River is one of the main tributaries, and it stays ice cold year round. And I think maybe it's 30 degrees Fahrenheit. And so by the time it gets to the lake, it's a lot warmer. And then just to reiterate what Conrad shared, if you go on Google Earth and you look at some of um the sides of the lake on the upper left, the east side of it, you can see the aerial images of cows just standing in the lake. And then I did quite a bit of paddling on. I've paddled the whole wood to the lake. It's not that long, 18 miles. And then I've done some paddling on the upper sections of the Sprague and the lower sections of the Williamson. And it's just very evident that the cows just stand in the river, in the lakes, and their the cow manure in the banks are just insanely depleted due to the way our farmers handle ag. And so that's one of the biggest issues that we have. But I believe, what is the saying, death by a million swords or something like
Death
that.
by a million paper cuts.
Yeah, that's the reality that our trauma, our COP2, and our water is facing in the upper Klamath Basin. And so there's just so many factors that are hitting us so hard that it feels like there's not much to do when we're watching the health of our lands, our waters, and our relatives.
Yeah, I want to add to your guys' point just really quick, especially something Conrad said about the water usage, because this is one of the reasons that I do policy or study policy in addition to engineering. So I also used to be an intern for the United States Senate Committee on Indian Affairs and have that policy minor in foreign policy and comparative government, and I've taken some law classes at Stanford for funsies. And that part of this is the fact that one, I can create the best engineering solutions in the world that solve all the water issues, but if there's not the policy in place for those solutions, then it doesn't matter. In addition to that, it's creating this public support, which is, I think, one of the things, my understanding is one of the things we're trying to do with this coalition is get that human aspect because, facts unfortunately don't always align with what people want. Like, for example, I worked on a feasibility project for a different engineering firm on the Klamath River, where I, as an engineer, was going to be able to create a wastewater treatment plant addition that was going to filter water from a wastewater treatment plant that was putting out too much nutrients and too much warm water into the Klamath. And instead, this water was going to be filtered from the treatment plant and then be used to water non-edible crops like alfalfa. And so it seemed like a win-win-win solution in my mind because the town was going to have to build a whole new water plant, which was going to cost them a lot of money. The farmers were going to have this land bought for, plus continue selling this alfalfa. And also, the river was not going to have as much hot water or nutrients put into it. And yet, because of negative public perception about wastewater and recycled water, it did not go through, despite it having would have been beneficial to a lot of groups. And so, right, I could have had that engineering solution, but because of the public support wasn't there, it didn't go through. And, engineers aren't necessarily the best advertisers or so working on that and getting people to understand some of these things. And in addition to like these water rights and this understanding water law that was put into place when people thought they were going to have unlimited water and they were like, oh, there's all this water. Let's, for example, make this policy in a sense that made sense, like that made sense at a time previously that does not apply to today and has incentives that actually make people use more water than less. Like Conrad said, people are afraid of losing their water rights if they don't use it all. And that's understandable from like an individual perspective. So we should change these policies and the way we see water usage to make it so we're conserving water instead of incentivizing using more water. So for me, that's where the policy intersects with engineering, intersects with the people.
Thanks so much, everyone. I'm going to pass it off to Becky if she still has she had her hand up a while ago. But before I do, I also want to acknowledge that what Halsey said in the comment, I like that he's talking about oceans. He says all that sediment building up behind the dams is nutrients lost to the oceans, which feed the phytoplankton and diatoms, which are the base of the food chain, and hence the collapse of of most coastal and ocean fisheries. I'll be really interested to see with this dam removal just what impact that has on our coastal ecosystems and fisheries. Becky, all you.
Well, I just want to lift up what Halsey wrote because I'm totally with him on that. But I am curious, being a small farmer. I know you've got a lot larger cattle ranches out there, but how is there any way of communicating with them? I mean, is there no way of creating a deal with them about maintaining enough water to feed their cattle? I mean, I have sheep, so I don't have cows, but I grew up with cows. Standing in water is bad for their feet. It is bad for their health. I mean, it's shocking to me that they would be putting the cows in that situation. And what's wrong with how is anyone allowing the manure to flow into the water? I mean, it's unbelievable to me that it's allowed. I mean, now I know in a matter of moments, Trump's going to get rid of any kind of environmental regulations, but for right now, it still holds that there should be no manure, no cows should be walking directly into water supply. So I don't understand how that's allowed to happen. But you did have the Bundys out there, didn't you?
Connor, do you want to go first? Because you can go first and then I'll add on.
Some of the old guard kind of asked the Bundys to leave finally. So like the powerful farmers who were part of the Klamath settlement agreements actually did ask, to their credits, ask them to get the hell out. So my focus is on water quantity / allocation. I just put a link in the chat. So to your question, Becky, there's clean water laws that should require you to keep your damn cows out of the river. But as far as water allocation and people taking too much, most energy goes toward what I call the high cost of coddling, asking people who are wasteful to do the right thing. On the flip side, the law already allows us to set in-stream flow requirements, meaning you have to leave a certain amount in the river overall. So both solutions still happen. A voluntary, can we beg and pay farmers to use less versus regulations? So I'm in favor of, I don't think a river should have to, or a tribe should have to pay water right holders to leave enough water in the river for fish not to go extinct. But nonetheless, that is what Nature Conservancy, Cal Trout, Trout Unlimited are pushing as a solution. So from my perspective, it becomes really hard when you're going to like foundations saying, hey, give us money to force the state to create in-stream flow requirements. Oh, we already got that covered, because they're being told that voluntary solutions are fixing it, and they're not, as is detailed in the report I put in the chat. 10-4.
Our rep in Maine is Shelley Pingree, who is in the ag. She is in the appropriations and particularly with agriculture. I probably will see. I'll see if I can share this with her. She's actually a friend of mine. So I don't know if she can have. I mean, who has any impact in Washington? Zero. But it would be nice if if she's at least aware of this. So.
Yeah, and then just to add on to what Conrad shared, there is state funding and a tribal employee in the water department for the Klamath tribes, where their job is to support farmers in getting the appropriate fencing to keep their cows out of the rivers and lakes. And there are a handful of farmers that are super appreciative of the funding support and have taken them up, have installed the fencing and gates and started keeping their cows out of the water. And then there's a lot of farmers that are openly, blatantly refusing to even acknowledge or be in conversation about that because they are so anti-tribe. for whatever reason that is, the historical systemic racism that we have to deal with. And so there's farmers where there's a dad who's about to hit his 90s, and his grandson runs the farm, the actual labor, and the grandson wants to do the fences, but the old man was like, no, we will not do it. And so that's like a case where our tribal employee is just like waiting until the grandson has that right and that call. And so there's families like that. And then there's also families where Conrad, he has seen how depleted our banks were on the Wood River. And then just with a few years of putting up some fences, it has really increased and kind of turned around with the health of our banks and our waters right there. But then they put gates by the river, and so they'll open them, let their calves go drink at the river. And then when we report them, they just lock them back up and say no, they were not. And so even with photo evidence, it's just been a difficult thing. And so there's not much more to say about that. It's just the willingness of individual farmers out there, and willing to comply with state and federal laws.
Yeah, adding to that quickly, Oregon, this depends state by state, but Oregon's a state, and I don't remember this exact law's name, but pretty much landowners who have like cow, horses, etc., can are allowed to let them like free range, like kind of go anywhere they want, and it's the owners of properties responsibility to like fence them out of their own property. And this is actually something we're dealing with the revegetation in the Klamath River. Is my understanding is that because there's been some issues with wildlife that's owned by certain people, but who have been spreading invasive species through their poop and eating all our expensive, nice native plants that we've been planting, that Res, the company who has been hired for the revegetation, had to actually buy a huge fence to like fence off acres of the undammed area that opened up when the water drained from the lakes. And so because of that law in Oregon, it's costing the revegetation extra money to keep all these animals out of the river, and stopping all this spreading of invasive species and eating of the native plants that we've been trying so hard to work on. And so that's just one more thing on top of like what Conrad and Aisha were saying, and that's an Oregon law specifically, but I know it's similar in other states too, whether you're allowed, it's your responsibility or the other person's responsibility to keep your animals enclosed.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm gonna stop the Q&A there because we are at time. And if there are more questions, feel free to send them to me and I can send them to the panelists, or if the panelists would like to share their information in the chat as well. But anyway, thank you all for joining us today for this webinar, and we hope you leave this space feeling more connected to the river, to each other, and to this global movement for free-flowing waters and Indigenous rights. A special thank you to our panelists, Brook, Konrad, Aisha, for sharing your insights and stories, and to all of you who've showed up with your curiosity and your care. We'll be sending out a follow-up email with the recording and all the links that we've been mentioning, including how to get involved with Rivers for Climate Coalition. So keep an eye on your inbox. And that's it. Everyone take care, and thank you so much for your time today. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.